Ian, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
A place we often start off with is kind of random, but I always like to see where it takes us. And it's very simply this. What is one of the first things that you can remember? If you cast your mind back, what's some of those early memories that start to emerge?
In life generally, you mean?
In the generality of your life.
I suppose my earliest memories would be the latter days of World War II. As a child, but still recall quite distinctively bombs, sirens, and just life as it was then, very difficult with roads blocked, fire engines and all the rest of it.
So what year were you born in?
41.
41, wow. And where was home for you at that time?
At that time, well, I was born in St Albans Abbey, of all places, which was a maternity home for London mothers-to-be. Christened in the cathedral at 6 days old, just in case, and ended up living in...
Fire insurance.
Exactly, yes. Ended up living in Carshalton, a suburb of South London.
Wow. And so your boyhood, very much in the backdrop of the war. Like, what were you like as a boy? What sort of things were you interested in?
It's hard to remember, really. I suppose just the general boy things. And in due course, I had a younger brother and two boys. You get up to a lot of mischief.
So the world of PIs, private investigators, crime, problem solving, Sherlock Holmes, sirens, at what point did that enter into your interest?
It fell on me in a family business which had a client who defaulted and left us holding a lot of financial babies. And I decided to go out and hunt him down and squeeze him to get some money out of him.
Wow.
Which I did. I managed to find him. He was broke, in tears, broken down. Ended up, my brother and I bought him coffee, bought him lunch, and we all shook hands and we knew we would get nothing further. But the enjoyment and the satisfaction of having located him had drawn my attention to a different way of life. And I hunted around and was lucky enough to find a job advertised as a trainee inquiry agent, as they used to be called.
Wow. And what was your family's business?
Building construction, primarily church building, and after the war reparations, rebuilding all the damaged churches around London.
Wow. Good time to be in business in some ways.
The business grew very fast.
I imagine that it did. Okay, so you kind of go off on this wild goose chase. You're finding this guy who owes you money. What was it about that process that made something in your brain light up and say, this is the drug for me?
Challenge.
Yeah.
It was the challenge and the satisfaction that you feel when you achieved a point. You found an old address or you confirmed where somebody was. You saw him. Great satisfaction. These were challenges that had to be met. And in those days, we didn't have the advantage of internet databases. Everything was the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
4 pennies in a phone box or whatever it was, or going to the local library. In those days, you could actually go to the police station and look at the electoral register.
Wow.
So things were on foot, shall we say. Old-fashioned.
Yeah.
Plodding, but you got there.
And so this first, if we call it job, okay, was this the 60s? When was this?
That was 1960, 61, around then.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, and as you say, a very, very different world. No Google Maps.
No, nothing. Nothing.
So how did you, and feel free to take us into another case if this is a better way of answering it, but like, and excuse maybe for being so rude, back in those days, how did you go about locating somebody in comparison to now? Because it seems to be probably a very different process.
Yes, well, we had to learn on the way. The individual concerned was part of a company. You could do a company house search and you got an address. The address usually turned out to be an accountant or a solicitor. And from there, you'd make some inquiries, usually a pretext. Believe it or not, they existed then. Delivering a package. And people in those days weren't so guarded. They would give you the address, or at least a whereabouts, and then a check in the old phone books. And then to the local library, going through voters lists, looking for names.
Class.
And then if you found the address, you went and knocked on the neighbour's door as if it was a mistake. And they said, oh, no, that's not us, that's next door. And there was your confirmation.
Wow. Very cool. So this, I forget the exact phrase that you used, but a junior investigator, what was
A trainee investigator.
Trainee.
Mm-hmm.
So like what type of company was looking for that sort of trainee?
Well, it was a private investigation company. They have been around for over 100 years, probably longer. And it was a company based in Kingston, operated by, I think you would call him a journalist, who turned to private investigations as being more remunerative.
Mm-hmm.
And he had managed to land contracts whereby banks and building societies and whatever had people that defaulted. They needed to find them. Sometimes just to get the address to serve legal documents, sometimes to recover goods. And later on, this turned into television repossessions. It's hard to believe it, but in those days, everybody that had a television, 90% of them were rented.
Wow.
From rental companies, and they had contracts. And if they didn't pay the monthly fee,
Yeah.
they employed people like us to go down and repossess the television.
Interesting. So
Yes.
the private investigator industry, in the capacity you were involved in, was very much in the marketplace. So it was very much to do with commerce, very much to do with money,
Yes.
getting back items and money that was owed to businesses, and you guys were the bridge in between, basically.
Well, fundamentally, yes. I mean, the investigation business has always been in different sectors.
Mm-hmm.
And in the UK, you tend to have the commercial investigation sector, which is primarily, as you say, to do with commerce. And you then get the more obvious private investigations dealing with matrimonial matters, missing persons, contract disputes, and so on. And of course, media,
Yeah.
touchy subject these days, but the media were major clients. I mean, the newspapers would engage us constantly to locate people
Wow.
because it was cheaper to use us than it was to pay the journalists to go out and do the work.
Interesting. Well, you also, I assume, had developed, it's the classic thing. If I try to fix my plumbing, it would take me, 10 hours versus the 30 minutes that the plumber would come in. So,
And it might leak.
yeah, well, it will leak. I can tell you in my case, it absolutely will leak. So you're in that commerce world. How does your career progress, and in what directions do you start to get pulled in?
Right. Well, fundamentally, in those first couple of years, I ended up covering all aspects of the work, domestic matters. And one of the stories in the book is the first major domestic case that we had, where the house owners, husband and wife, had a dispute. The wife decided to go off for the weekend with the children, having given us the keys to get in, leaving her husband free to bring whoever he wanted back home.
Yeah.
So I was stuck in the loft, perched above the main bedroom. And you have to remember, in these days, to get a divorce, you had to prove to the court that a sexual act had taken place, sexual intercourse had taken place.
Yeah, yeah.
Anything less than that, you wouldn't get a divorce.
Wow.
So the evidence was a requirement of law. So the only way you could get it was to have people like me, I was relatively small, up in the loft, over the bedroom.
On your CV, relatively small, a marketable asset.
Yeah. Well, it was an important point, believe me, being stuck up in that loft. And it was a hot day. I was there from about 4:00 in the afternoon. And the husband didn't get back till about 10 o'clock or so at night.
Wow.
During the afternoon, the sun was belting down. It was sweating. I was sweating, busting to go out for a pee.
Of course.
And couldn't get out because I was in the loft.
Yeah.
And my boss, he was hiding in the children's bathroom.
Crazy.
And we had to wait and wait and wait. We had to be there at that time just in case he came home early.
Yeah.
And eventually he came home, complete with a young lady.
Yeah.
And off they go and have a few drinks and then decide to go to bed. And of all the luck, instead of going to the main bedroom above which I'm perched, they go to one of the children's bedrooms.
Oh, no.
Yes. So
Your man's in the bathroom.
He's in the bathroom.
Oh,
he
no.
doesn't know what's happening. So the only thing I could do was to creep very carefully across the rafters of the roof. I could hear roughly where the bedroom was. And as I crept slowly towards it, trying to make no noise. My foot, I think it was the left one, slipped.
Oh, Ian.
It hit the top of the ceiling, and suddenly it just went through. So there was a crashing of plaster and ceiling. In absolute panic and trying to pull it back up, my other leg went through.
Oh, Ian, no.
And I slipped through and was hanging for my life to one of the rafters, looking down at this dust and smoke everywhere from the dust flying around. This naked couple on the bed looking in absolute shock. At which time, of course, my boss had heard the noise and come running in with the camera to get the money shots of them in bed cavorting, or on the bed cavorting, along with bits of broken plaster. He then carefully lifted me down and, having dusted ourselves off in the anger of the man whose ceiling had just been wrecked, explained why we were there. I cautioned him, as you did in those days, and invited him to make a confession statement, as they used to be called, admitting his adultery with the young lady in question.
Yeah.
And after he'd cooled down, he agreed to do so. She jumped up off the bed and went and knew her way around the house, turned up with a pot of tea.
Wow.
And we sat there and I took statements from them both.
Yeah.
And a few months later, she got a divorce and got the property and got custody of the children, all the good things that the hurt party would desire.
Yeah.
And she then took my boss and I to a very fine lunch at the Savoy Hotel in London.
Very nice.
Yes. So that was the first of my major domestic cases.
And an eventful
One not
one.
to be forgotten.
Okay, so I mean, I feel like I could spend the rest of our time together just talking about like follow-ups to all this. Okay, a very simple follow-up question that I have is, what is your jurisdiction? So in that case, you're allowed in the house because the wife has given you permission and keys and access, and so that means that you're a welcomed guest in that house as far as the law is concerned.
We
and all
have
that
a
sort of
legal
stuff.
right to be there. Yes.
Cool.
Yes. Jurisdiction. We have no extra jurisdiction to any other person.
Yeah.
And consequently, we have to always be very cautious of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, to make sure that we don't put ourselves, or in particular our clients, at any legal risk, which may lead to damages or a loss of case.
Yeah, it's a really interesting part of the problem-solving aspect to your job is
Absolutely.
you have no superpowers. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're a comic book character that has no special abilities.
Absolutely. No, it's just our wit, that's all.
Yeah. Very interesting. And then the other thing that I kind of feel like this almost emerged earlier in the conversation as well, this idea that deep down people want to tell the truth. Like a lie is a very strong burden to carry around. And, you know, that couple, for example, when they'd cooled down, they must have felt great after getting that all out in the open.
Oh, yes. No, he actually made the comment at the time, and I've actually quoted it in the book, and that I'm actually pleased you're here because it brings everything to a head.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk to me about that. You know, your job is effectively, this is a very strange way to put it, it's to reveal truth.
Well, a lot of us actually say that one of our aims is to establish the truth. Evidence gathering is determining the truth.
So talk to me more about that. Talk to me about the power of the truth and how people have responded to the truth, both victims and perpetrators, and any way you want to take it, actually. It's a very open question about truth, but I'm interested.
Yes, well, of course, in virtually all civil litigation and criminal litigation in the UK and elsewhere, we operate on the adversarial system, which means to say that one side is saying one thing and the defence is trying to say the opposite. And so very often private investigators will be engaged to go out to determine the truth of somebody's statement. And when that truth comes out, the court or the jury, depending on the type of case, can make a decision which is hopefully right more times than it's wrong. So being able to verify or substantiate an alibi, for example, can be an absolutely vital thing. And there have been an awful lot of cases where people have been found guilty that were totally innocent, and we see them all the time coming up and claiming huge damages for the mistaken prosecutions. Had the system permitted in the UK investigative techniques to be used on behalf of the defence as well as the prosecution, who have the power of the police behind them, whereas very often the defence have got no facilities to go out and gather evidence or to test evidence.
It's a very interesting point.
This would be a very great step forward. And in the States, for example, it's absolutely normal. The courts, along with granting legal aid to an accused, will very often grant a certificate to engage a private investigator.
Interesting.
Most public defenders' offices, we would call them defence lawyers, have full-time investigators employed in the States to test all the evidence. And although it adds a burden in costs, in the bigger picture, the truth has got no limitation of value.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You know, I don't pretend to understand the legal system of anywhere in any great detail, but that difference between over here and the US, that plays out with massive ramifications.
Oh, absolutely huge.
Wow.
Yes. I mean, in the US, virtually not every state, but most states are licensed, which actually gives some rights and some powers to the private investigator, and also gives them the obligations of maintaining the standard of that license and the conditions.
Yeah.
But for example, if as a licensed PI in the States, you can go into a police station, police department, and you can get quite a lot of cooperation on the basis you're all on the same side.
Yeah.
Aiming to find the truth. Whereas over here, of course, if a PI goes anywhere near a police station now, they start to lock it down.
Interesting. So let's stay there for a second. On a very basic level, what is the difference between a private investigator in the UK and a police officer in the UK? And yeah, I'll keep it as simple as that.
Well, it's quite simple. The police officer is an officer that's appointed by the public for the public, and to perform the functions of maintaining life, securing life, preventing and detecting crime, and prosecuting those that have committed offences. The private investigator doesn't have the same powers in terms of arrests. One has to keep in mind that a police officer has certain statutory powers to arrest. So does everybody else in the country. You have some powers by common law to arrest, but they're limited by comparison to the police. And from a private investigator's perspective, you tend to be engaged by a single client for a single purpose or series of purposes. You're working for the individual and not for the public as a whole.
Yeah.
The fundamental work is not that much different.
Yeah.
The objectives are different.
Yeah. Well, I think the key unlock there for me was that you're working for a private individual.
Exactly.
And you're trying to achieve their aims, whatever their aims are. That's interesting. Did you ever have any sort of, driven by that sense of justice, or, do you have a burden to, reveal truth? Is it more so the problem-solving side of the profession that really pulled you in? Talk to me about that, like your own motivations.
No, I think fundamentally the original attraction was the challenge of problem-solving.
Yeah.
The value in terms of the truth and the satisfaction you get is great, and also the frustration you feel when something goes wrong. In my career, I've been fortunate, if that's the right word, to have dealt with some very high-profile criminal cases where people have been convicted and jailed. And try as we might, we have failed in many of those cases to be able to obtain enough evidence to be able to satisfy the courts that the case is a case of wrong conviction, and to have it reopened and retried. So that has been a frustration point. There have been a few cases where we've actually got people off, where we've found new evidence, and that is a fantastic high.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about job satisfaction.
Oh, yes.
You know, the impact that has on somebody's life is just, you can't even begin to put it into words.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
So you were working for this company with the boss who was in the bathroom.
Yes.
Well, what happens next in your career?
Well, from there on, I was married at that time. My first child came along, and I decided we needed to get a house. And at that time, you could make an application to join the police service.
Oh, okay.
And where I was going, they had houses available. So I, after 2 years, took leave and left and joined Surrey Constabulary and ended up as the village policeman in a little village called Newhaw in Surrey, near Woking. And because I was relatively short, I just about made the 5'8" with a stretch. They put me on a motorcycle. I'd been motorcycling for a long time.
Yeah.
So they put me in a motorcycle, and I ended up being, they used to call them in those days speed cops
Nice.
for some reason. Can't imagine why. And looking after the village police station.
Unbelievable.
That I was there for a little over 2 years, and my old boss came back and hunted me down and made me an offer which, as they say, I couldn't refuse.
I love that. So you go from a very big city, big story, big smoke, backdrop of the war, you know, very dynamic, to this seemingly, based on the way you described it, sleepy little place.
Yes.
Talk to me about those 2 years of your life.
Wonderful.
I
Wonderful
imagine
years.
they were.
Yes, wonderful. One of the nicest things about being a motorcycle cop in those days, you're on your own. So rather like as I was as a PI, most of the time working on my own around back streets of London, no, I was working in country lanes on the motorcycle, going to all kinds of things.
Wow.
And so, some of the amazing things, I'm sure young people today wouldn't realise it, but we didn't have any motorways then, but we did have dual carriageways. And one of the biggest dual carriageway was the A3, which went down to the south coast from London, the A30, another major road. And if there was an accident, they would send a motorcycle cop because you can get there the fastest through the traffic. And when you got there you were with this major accident, maybe people, bodies, casualties lying around. You're the only one there. And you had to deal with the whole thing on your own.
Wow.
There was no hundreds of cars turning up, streets blocked off, closed for 24 hours for investigations. It was to get the traffic moving again ASAP, get the casualties to hospital, bodies to the morgue, wrecked vehicles off the road, and get the road open. That's what it was all about. And many of those things, the inspector would turn up 2 hours after the event because if there was a death, the inspector had to turn up.
Yeah.
So he would come down 2 hours after when it was all clear. And if the traffic wasn't moving smoothly, he'd be giving you a thick ear.
Yeah.
Very different from now when you see an accident, for example, on one of our motorways, it's closed.
Yep.
You get police cars galore all over the place, fire engines, rescue vehicles, helicopters. None of that existed. So you went down there and you had to control it yourself. And the way that you did it, you went for the professional drivers, the lorry drivers. And you'd say to one, you go down there, control the traffic. You go the other way, control the traffic. You get over there, look after that person in the road. You call the ambulance, tell me what's happened. It was all done by the public, just with one young policeman trying to control it all, sometimes with a great sweat on.
It's a remarkable skill set to develop. You know, that the ability to build a team on the fly from members of the public who are strangers, that is really, really interesting.
That was normal in all police forces during the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah. Was it a time of rest? Was there a sense of it was a time for you to, I don't know, recover from high intensity of city life, or did you get antsy, or?
No, not really.
Not at all?
No. I'm one of those people that my father always used to say, I'm busy doing nothing. I just found things to do all the time. And,
Sure.
you know, as a police officer there, the frustrating part was being on 8-hour shifts.
Yeah.
And then being told that you're off duty for 16 hours. And very often, myself and other people on the unit, the department, the motorcycle units, we would often stay off for extra 4 hours for which we got no overtime. And you didn't get overtime in those days. You got units off. For every hour that you worked, you got an hour and a quarter off.
Wow.
So the more you worked overtime, if you booked it, the more time you had to take off.
Yeah.
So, no, we used to work extra hours free of charge.
Mad. And so, other than the money, what was the attraction for the offer that you couldn't refuse?
I was on, that's almost embarrassing to say it, after all deductions, £52, 10 shillings was my monthly pay as a police officer. The Met Police just across the river from me, 100 yards or so away, if you're standing by the river.
Yeah.
They were 3 times that amount of money at that time. So you ended up with a lot of shortage of officers with transfers.
Yeah, a lot of people went across the river.
Just moved, yes. So I was offered a salary of £1,000 a year, which in those days was a considerable salary.
Yeah, yeah.
And
was really double what you were making, isn't it?
Yeah, well over it, yes. And then commission on top. And the commission was a motivator. So
okay, so like what sort of commission?
I was on 10% of the commission above a base level. So if I managed to make sales in the company I became manager of, sales over a certain amount, I can't remember exactly, maybe 1,000 a month or something like that. Then over that, you got 10%.
Yeah.
And so I worked 21 hours out of 24, pumping out invoices and getting work done.
And you were selling PI contracts, or what were you selling?
No, we were locating people.
Locating
people, repossessions, motor car repossessions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, very cool. And how do you move into then more of the types of cases that are documented in this book right here?
Well, as life went along, I did 2 years of a contract, had some amazing cases with that company, including the one case, again, the younger ones won't remember it, the Jeremy Thorpe case, Liberal MP that got prosecuted for conspiring to murder his homosexual lover at a time when homosexuality was still illegal. And I got involved in that. My first trip to Ireland was to track down Norman Scott, his lover, so that he could be paid off by the Liberal Party as it was then to keep it out of the media.
Wow.
But things developed, and as I've written in there, Jeremy Thorpe allegedly conspired with some of his party officials to hire a murderer to go down and shoot Norman Scott, which actually happened, but he shot the dog and the gun jammed. So killed his dog, but the gun jammed and got away. Jeremy Thorpe was charged and found not guilty by the court, by the jury, and life went on for him. He never went back into politics, of course, but at one time he was likely to be a potential Prime Minister of the UK.
Wow.
Yes, and we thought we had problems today.
And what's your connection to this place?
To Northern Ireland?
Yes, sir.
Yes. I came to Northern Ireland in 1970s on cases and worked with a private investigator here in Belfast by the name of Thomas Marshall Orr, who was known as Martial Law locally.
Very good.
He provided store detectives to virtually all of the major stores in Belfast City, and he provided security to the Europa Hotel, which had just been taken over and was being renovated to become one of the most famous hotels in the world of that era. While I was there, I met one of his store detectives, and shall we say, I fell in love. So did she. So she told me. And eventually, of course, I got divorced from my first wife and ended up getting married, and consequently came backwards and forwards to Ireland. I opened an office here in Belfast in 1972 and in Dublin, the height of the Troubles. And the magic of it was that I was still living in England and flying over to deal with the clients and deal with the work. And most of the other PIs that were here had switched to security, which was grant aided. The government paid them to do things like check handbags at barriers and store doors, things that young people won't have to remember, thank God. And eventually, of course, the office here, we got targeted by the provisionals and they blew the office up. And in a way that made us even more motivated not to walk away. So we developed the business here. Eventually, I was persuaded, as always happens with Irish wives, to pack up everything in England and come to Ireland. My family thought I was stark raving mad to leave peaceful Shoreham, Sussex, and come to Belfast. But I've never regretted it.
Wow.
And been here basically ever since, except when I got a contract in the Indian Ocean in Seychelles and went there for 7 or 8 years.
Hey, except for that small little detail. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So Belfast, good for business?
Excellent, yes. Had no competition.
Wow. And you moved to Belfast at a very intense time.
Oh, it was an amazingly intense time.
Yeah.
So very lucky in many ways that I wasn't here to be targeted directly because I was living in England. I would fly over, stay with the in-laws, do 3 or 4 days of work and then go back. In those days, we had the shuttle to and from London. So it was easy to get here, relatively cheap.
When you say the shuttle, I've no idea what that is.
Oh, as British Airways operated a system where you turned up at the airport when the airplane was full, they flew and got another airplane lined up and just backwards and forwards. Even Concorde and occasionally a 747 would perform a shuttle mission.
Unbelievable.
Yes. And my memory tells me it was £12 each way, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah.
But no, but you just go to Heathrow Airport and go to the lounge and you just wait till they called the flight.
That's crazy.
Yes, it's just amazing. It made it a lot easier from a travel. I had a car over here. I kept a car here at the airport, so that I was available. I just arrived and could drive where I wanted to go. We got a very good source of business from the courts, which was done through the solicitors, but the court officers wouldn't go into West Belfast, for example, because they were deemed to be working for the Crown, but therefore potential targets. And reasonably enough, they didn't want to go there. So when it come to serving legal process, bankruptcies, divorces, and all the rest of it, it all had to be done privately. And we had the job once every 2 weeks. I would do a run up the falls. We got the cooperation of the army, used to go in the back of a Saracen and go up to address, serving bankruptcies and divorces and goodness knows what else. And I can honestly say never ever had a bit of trouble doing that.
It's not interesting.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And people would be very welcoming. They'd bring you in for a cup of tea and cake, wait for the husband or the son to come home.
Yeah.
Who'd accept the process. I don't think they did anything about it, but they accepted it as part of life. And we never had any problems.
That's interesting.
And the first issue we had was when they targeted the office in Wellington Park and they planted a firebomb in there, which luckily nobody was killed or seriously injured. And the building was destroyed, and so it was the French legation next door that was destroyed. It took about 4 or 5 years to get the compensation, but the bank did make funds available for us to move to another office.
Yeah.
And from that moment onwards, I used a PO box address, so I didn't have to reprint and change all the clients' details.
Yeah.
So we had a PO right up until recent times, a PO box address.
Yeah. Interesting. So you never had any bother having an English accent?
No.
At the height of the Troubles?
No.
That's crazy to me. No. You, again, this is a very movie-like understanding of what your job is, which is obviously very far from the truth. I think about, Private Investigator. I think about, the ability to blend in, the ability to not stand out. And here you are rocking up in Belfast with a big English accent. Did it ever work in your favour?
I don't think it was a disadvantage at any point, but I can't say it was a favour at any point. No, people, I think, generally speaking, just took you as somebody that had blown in as like a tourist type situation. And if anything, the people were just generally friendly.
Yeah.
I never found any direct hatred, if you like. I think that was very local, not to the race as a whole.
Yeah.
But for example, some of the impossible jobs that people asked you to do then, apparently impossible, they would need film footage of somebody making a claim, for example, for a work injury. And so they would live in a difficult area. For example, if it could be the Falls, it wasn't particularly difficult. It could be the Falls, it could be any other part.
Yeah.
And they would engage us then to go up and do filming, to film somebody coming out, go into their car, how they get in, how they move, to determine whether they're exaggerating a claim. So when you think about that in those days, it's virtually a no-go.
Yeah.
To be out there trying to film somebody. But we managed it. We did it in a very different way. Instead of doing what we normally do, and that is being very, very subtle and very hidden and blending in with the past, we did the opposite. We got a great big shoulder camera, got a girl with a clipboard, and we went up there and we started doing a survey outside the house. But the cameraman was always pointing where he had to go. And that was normal there because you had loads of TV crews from all over the world trying to interview people about the troubles. So we just fitted in. And it worked beautifully. We managed to get quite a lot of evidence on various cases that were settled.
Yeah.
Yes. The most memorable one, of course, was the man that had lost his sight in a work-related accident, and we managed to follow him, where he was picked up, driven off down the Bangor Road towards a well-known golf club. Halfway down the road, he got out of the car, took his bandage off, put his white stick in the back, and his wife swapped seats, and he drove on down to Bangor to play golf.
Crazy.
It was settled out of court.
I would imagine that it is. So talk to me about Sandra Valentine.
Sandra Valentine, 28, 29-year-old girl, very successful in business, New York, the only daughter of a lawyer who had remarried. His wife had died, he'd remarried. So Sandra lived with her stepmother and father in New York. She had come out of university. She'd been learning Japanese. She went to work for Rank Xerox, the photocopy company. And somehow she had a gift. Inside a matter of 2 or 3 years, she was their top salesperson in New York, had accumulated enough money, bought herself an apartment, which is no mean feat in New York.
Definitely not.
A nice new car, and then decided to do, as so many of kids do these days, young people do, to go off on a world tour.
Yep.
So she and her friend went off and they decided to travel west. So they went to the west coast, down to Australia, and over a period of a year, went up through Asia, eventually got to India, and all the time she kept in touch with the family, postcards, little parcels arriving with things that she bought. And then one day, there was a period where nothing came in, 2 or 3 weeks. Parents got worried. They called, I had an associated office then in the States. They called that office to see whether they could engage us to locate her because they were concerned. So I lived in Seychelles at that time. So my US office contacted me because I was geographically speaking in a close location to India compared to the US. And I flew directly to Nairobi, which in Kenya, and she was expected to arrive on a particular date there to catch in those days, Pan Am flight back to the States via Frankfurt. And of course, she never turned up. And the father was getting into an absolute panic. I got sent on to India to make inquiries. And one of the horrific things in India was having made a radio broadcast on Indian radio on behalf of the family, appealing for information. I got a call from the police in the southern part of India to say there had been a train crash and that there were a number of unidentified female bodies in the morgue. And I flew down to, I think it was Chennai or somewhere down there, and was taken to this morgue. And there were 127 female bodies that were unclaimed and unidentified. 17 were what you would call European-looking, white-skinned, frozen quite hard. But it was a pretty horrendous thing to walk through that morgue, looking at all these dead bodies to see if I could recognise our missing girl.
Yeah.
But she wasn't there, and I was pleased to be able to phone the client up and say, well, she's not amongst that lot. And then at that time, he got a delayed postcard. It took a month to get there from Sri Lanka. And so I got sent ultimately to Sri Lanka to follow the trail, managed to identify where she'd stayed, and then followed her route, and eventually got to a tea plantation up in the mountains where I managed to find her signature on the visitor's book. There was only about 10 visitors on that day, so I took the names and addresses of from the book of the others. My office then contacted all of those people, and we managed to find a German doctor and his wife that remembered her and gave her a lift into town, dropped her at a hotel. And I went to the hotel, showed the photographs, and they were very cooperative. And they produced a little book showing that she'd made phone calls from there but hadn't stayed. The phone calls we managed to identify were to the airline, and we managed to find that she'd delayed her flight, intending to stay. And the parents by that time were so panicked that they'd taken the flight. So I went back to Colombo, the capital, picked them up at the hotel, met them at the hotel. We had dinner, and they were tired after a long flight from the States. We all went to bed about 10 o'clock, and about midnight, there or abouts, I got a call from the manager at the hotel to say they'd found a female body in a river in the hotel's grounds. So I had to wake them up, which probably was one of the nastiest things I had to do in my life, was to wake them up and tell them that we think they found their daughter and she's dead. The driver that I'd been using had gone off for the weekend thinking he was free.
Sure.
So we had to use the hotel car. We drove up on the next morning and went into the mortuary where the pathologist, Indian pathologist, took me, and the father didn't want to go in immediately, and the mother wouldn't go in at all. But I went in there, and I could see from the photographs that I had, it was definitely her. And as I'm standing talking to the pathologist, and it was down as an accidental death, presumed drowning, she was found completely naked, so it wasn't a good sign. In the river, the fast-moving water, so clothes can get washed off. But as I was looking at the body and shining in the light over her, I saw a very faint line around her throat, just like a pencil line around the throat. And I said to the pathologist, "What's that look like?" And he had to look at it. He says, "I don't know." And he started to play around, and then he realised that it was a nylon cord, like a fishing line, that she'd been strangled with. And where she'd been in the water, it puffed up and covered it, just that line there. And I don't want to go into the messy details of why we were doing that. It was to do with her facial features. We were trying to make her as natural as possible for the parents to identify her.
Yeah.
Anyway, we did that, and the father eventually came in and confirmed it was the daughter. So the pathologist then changed the potential cause of death to murder, and that resulted in a legal requirement in Sri Lanka for the body to be removed to the main police autopsy centre in Colombo. And we went down there. The pathologist there, police pathologist, was very uncooperative, and he said he didn't think it because her teeth were stained, and she'd been eating some kind of nut that they chew in Sri Lanka. Her teeth were stained with that nut, and he didn't think that was normal for a foreign girl to do. So in the meantime, we contacted her dentist in New York, and he faxed over copies of her dental images. And we went down the next day to the autopsy centre to be told that in accordance with their policies, she'd been incinerated and they kept photographs only. So we were not able to make a positive ID other than from the photographs. But even her dentist afterwards, from the photographs, said from what he could see, they were an absolute match. So we're quite convinced it was her. And of course, at that time, I made a very strong complaint to the police and to the press. And the result of that was that the President's office invited the parents and myself to have tea. And the President, that was very pleasant, said that he'd now directed the police to make a full-scale inquiry. Would I hand over everything that we'd achieved on the way, which I did, and I flew back to Seychelles. Within a week, the police had started to make the search. They found her backpack in the grounds of a property not far from the hotel. Her passport was there, but her credit cards were missing. What was really interesting is they found the bodies of 5 other girls in the same area. And ultimately they arrested a Sri Lankan gang that 2 of them admitted that they'd been involved in the murders, but they couldn't identify which girls they'd murdered. So in theory, it still was a case of an unsolved case.
Yeah.
But it was a pretty horrific case.
Yeah.
It lasted, I was there for about 3 weeks on it.
Yeah. And I'm just struck by the scale of the case in terms of you're flying here, you're flying there, you're going to a tea plantation, you're looking at a visitor's book, you're contacting, you know, it's the scale of that's phenomenal.
Yes, but when it's done privately, as against police, somebody has to pay for it. So it's paid by the client. The client was a fairly well-to-do tax lawyer, and money wasn't an object for him. We didn't make a lot of money out of it as a job. We had fixed rates, so whatever the result, the rates would have been the same. The expenses were quite high. That was the thing on that.
For you personally, it's a lot to deal with.
Oh, it is. It is a lot.
The scene you describe in the morgue.
Yes.
You know, the waking the parents up.
That was the awful thing. Is dealing with death is a horrible thing. But when I was in the police, going back a few years, for 3 months I was coroner's officer, which meant I had to spend my mornings going to postmortems. Yeah. Which 3 or 4 postmortems in the morning and go home for lunch. Yeah. You harden to it. Yeah, of course. And you have to. Yeah. You have to, otherwise you just would never survive it.
It's interesting that, you know, everyone we talk to on this show, the recurrent theme that we see is that everything that you do in your journey prepares you for the next step off that journey. Yes. And so, you know, that pencil line mark that you described, you know, your eye was tuned.
Yes. Absolutely.
And it was tuned from, you know, endless days of 3 postmortems before lunch. And it's valuable going forward in everything that you do.
It's experience you can't buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. This business that you're talking about, tell me about it.
The business?
Yeah.
You've lost me. Which business? In general, or?
Yeah. So you're talking about you moved to Belfast.
Ah, okay. Back to Belfast. Yes.
But you're talking about even with the Sandra Valentine case, you're working for the business at this stage. You have an office that you're sending details back to.
Yes. Well, we created a company.
Cool.
And the company, I expanded the company from the mid-70s onwards by franchising. So what I was successful at doing was to sell the concept of a PI business to people that were equipped to deal with that, mostly retired or ex-police officers or ex-military. So they would buy a franchise for an area and they would then pay a flat fee each month.
Nice.
And in return, I would provide backup services for all the things they might need that they wouldn't have necessarily the skills or the context to be able to deal with.
Very smart.
So one time we had, I think, 14 franchises. In Ireland, we had them in Dublin, in Limerick, in Galway, and in Cork, and of course Belfast. So And then we had a similar batch in England, in Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, in the Channel Islands, Jersey, and London, North and South, and Brighton. Yes. So these were all the ones that we gradually built up. So we had quite an influx of work from many sources and a great deal of variety coming in. The normal routine work, locating people, serving summonses, picking up goods that had to be repossessed, doing reports on people's financial status to determine whether it's worth suing them or not. These were the routine bread and butter things. But every now and again, one of the officers will get a job in, for example, a defence case on a murder charge. These were interesting cases. So when they came in, they usually came back up to me. We called it head office. And did it from there. And in 1979, I got a phone call late one night inviting me to take up a surveillance for a week on 4 people in London, 24 hours. Well, it sounds simple, but it's a major job. To try and watch somebody for 24 hours for 7 days requires a lot of people, a lot of cars. That's what we set up to do. And I was a bit concerned because it was going to be an expensive job and I needed some front money, deposit, security. So the client was based in Rome at that time, and I said I needed a deposit, and it was a female, and she said, well, send somebody to Rome and I'll give them some money. So I did. I sent one of my colleagues to Rome in the early flight from Gatwick the next morning, and he duly met the client, picked up, I think it was like £1,000 or something. It was a lot of money in those days. Of course, it seems silly now. But and then he flew back, and in the meantime, we had an office in Croydon as well at that time, and I'd camped up at the office in Croydon. One of the secretaries came up there to type the reports. These were the days when there was no word processors, everything was a typewriter. So we had to have a typist up there to do it all. Everything was by dictation. So the agents would dictate their reports, come back, and she would translate them and transcribe them into respectable reports. A week or so later, I got invited to go to a rather famous London hotel to deliver the reports. And we'd been following 4 people quite successfully, and we were quite proud of the job, lots of photographs, lots of information. When I went, I met this very attractive Italian lady who presented her cheeks to be kissed, which I duly obliged, and was taken in to meet 3 men. One was her husband, a bearded gentleman looking quite outstanding. One was his assistant, and the third one was one of the people we'd been following.
Wow.
And to say I was shocked. I thought, what have we been led into?
Yeah, what on earth is about to happen?
And he was then introduced to me as being a Minister of State for the Republic of Seychelles. And he'd been on the list to determine how accurate our surveillance had been.
Wow.
A quality control.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I had a very nice lunch in the Carlton Towers Hotel, which advertised and boasted that all of its guests are completely secure for their private meetings, etc., which seemed important. And they paid me out in cash with a bonus on top.
Wow.
And off I went, happy as Larry, with a little extra money for the staff for Christmas.
Yeah.
And it took about 3 months before I got another call, invited me to go to a meeting in Milan, in Italy. So I trusted them by then, so I jumped on the plane and went to Milan. I was met by the assistant, who was a bit like an Italian racing driver with a very bright, very loud Alfa Romeo sports car.
Nice.
And we had a high-speed drive from the airport into the centre of Milan, where I was taken to his amazing luxury apartment, which was basically the entire ground floor and the basement of what was the occupied apartment building. And they had all these flats all joined into one. It was amazing. It was like a museum. There were shark's jaws on the walls, all kinds of there were alligators or crocodiles stuffed on the wall, and animal heads. Anyway, I was invited to prepare a proposal for the government of Seychelles to provide external security to the government. And I asked, well, why haven't you gone to the UK? You're a British Commonwealth country. Surely the UK would provide that. But no, the UK wouldn't, because it was a single-party state of the left-wing variety, Marxist, as they called it in those days. And the Foreign Office said they couldn't provide services and this was democracy, but they did provide some companies that might be able to help. I was one of the companies, and I was the lucky one that answered the phone at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Crazy.
So I prepared a proposal together with my lawyers. We prepared a proposal, got it cleared by the Foreign Office that we could work for them. And the next thing that happened, I got invited to a meeting in Victoria. Fine. Why they give me a week's notice for Victoria? I lived in Brighton at that time. It's just up the road. Mm-hmm. But no, this was Victoria, the capital of Seychelles. Yes, so I jumped on the plane on a Friday, arrived on a Saturday, 4 hours sleep, lunch, meeting with the president and the ministers. Sunday, relax in the morning, and the afternoon it was a barbecue, and then to the airport for 11 o'clock at night for Air France. I was back in my office midday Monday.
Wow.
Yes, and that was the beginning of a 7-year contract. And I went up and down to Seychelles by whatever means were available, sometimes 4 times a month. It's just incredible. I just wish I collected all the air miles. Yes, so that went on very well. Seychelles became a major client. Uh-huh. And then in 1985, during the time I was there was a mercenary attack by Mad Mike Hoare, the Irish mercenary of Mad Geese fame. He attacked the island. We fortunately knew in advance the result of our work. We managed to get one of our people undercover working for the opposition, and he was sent to the Seychelles as a mercenary to try and gel the local opposition groups down there. And this was all about somebody trying to take over the country and overthrow the leftist government of the day. So the end result of that was 1985. I spent most of the year in Seychelles doing bodyguard duties. And in November, the leader of the opposition was murdered in London. What can I say? It was the end of the contract. On top of that, I was the number one suspect. So the police, who didn't like me for many reasons, decided that I was the number one suspect. I can't honestly say they didn't do anything else, but it doesn't appear that they did anything else, because they never ever came to interview me, despite my lawyer having invited them many times to create an appointment or to come to Seychelles. The government offered to fly them down at no charge, but they never ever came down. And eventually, of course, I retired in Seychelles, then decided not to come back to the UK because I had a young family, and I certainly didn't want to come back and have to start fighting a big legal case which would skint me. So I eventually went back to Dublin, bought a house in Dublin and lived down there for a few years. And then the peace dividend happened up here, and my Belfast wife decided we're going home. So I took the chances and went home. And while I was in Dublin, I went to London many occasions. I just didn't advertise the fact I was going to London. But I opened offices I bought back my old office in Brighton.
Nice.
And I opened an office in central London, Docklands. I bought a property in Croydon, within the Metropolitan Police area, and became involved in the licensing debate of the private investigation sector, attending meetings with the Home Office next door to Scotland Yard. At no time did they ever contact me or approach me.
Wow.
And then We moved up here. I transferred the head office of the company to Belfast and left the others as franchised. And in 2016, my wife unfortunately died. She got sick while we were in Cyprus and came home, and she passed away after 6 months or so in the hospital. 2 years after that, I think it was 2018, I came back from Cyprus one morning to be visited by the PSNI, about 4 or 5 vehicles, about 14 armed men. The TV cameras had been pre-notified, so they were there already. And they popped in and told me that they had a warrant for my arrest for conspiracy to murder. And I was carted off to London. They took everything from the office. My office was at the house. They took all the computers, mobile phones, carted off to London, and they kept me for 2 days. At the end, I was released, and they returned all the things they'd taken a few months later. Technically, I'm still on police bail, and despite efforts by my lawyer, we can't get to a point where they say they're going to do anything or not. The interesting point, of course, is that's the first time since the murder took place in 1985 they decided to interview me. And as a conspiracy, the other persons on the warrant, along with me, were all dead. One was the president of Seychelles, deceased. The Minister of Defence for Seychelles, deceased. The Italian middleman, deceased. The 2 people that were involved in the bugging of the house in London, deceased. I was the last man alive. It seems really, really odd. But they have to do their job, so
yeah,
there we are.
Obviously, you're silver-tongued enough to know not to say anything that will jeopardize anything. But like, can you comment on why you think the timing of it? Is it just an unchecked box somewhere that someone's trying to tick?
I won't be subjudicial by saying that there was a change of government in Seychelles.
Yeah.
The government I worked for was a left-wing single-party state.
Yeah.
They brought back democracy in 1995, and for the next 3 general elections, the same government won. Mm-hmm. And then in or about 2017-18, a new government came into power, which you would say was the same government that had been the party I had been investigating for the first government. So consequently, I think they had their own ideas,
sure,
and they wanted to push for it to be brought up to date, shall we say.
Yeah.
So I think it was a closed case which was reopened. Like any murder case in the UK, and I'm sure other places, they never close.
Yeah.
You know, and they shouldn't. I mean, somebody has to be responsible for it. I won't go into who I think is responsible for it, or indeed who I've discussed with the police as being responsible for it. But I'm pretty sure that they're satisfied that it's nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
They said as much when I was released. They even paid for me to have a hotel at Heathrow Airport and a luxurious meal at their expense. I even got the air miles for the flight.
You're tracking air miles now, aren't you? Very good. So, do you not have a sense of, this is an extreme word to use, but a sense of dread that this could be opened up at any time? Do you sleep well at night? Is there any, as much as you have satisfied, you know, all of the questions, the fact that it's still kind of open, does that bother you?
Well, it annoys me that it's open, and I think a lot of that annoyance is the fact that they didn't deal with it at the time.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I mean, everything should be dealt with in a murder literally within 24 hours, and then you get to the hard work of following up.
Yeah.
It just is beyond belief that somebody gets killed in a London street. They know that I've been following the man for years, but it's public information. It's been in the newspapers, it's been on television. They know that I've been following him and my company's been following him. They know that we've infiltrated his organisation. And yet, for some reason, they do not send somebody out to Seychelles,
Yeah.
or even arrange an appointment where they can guarantee I'm not going to be, in those days, arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism
Yeah.
and held incommunicado for 6 or 7 days. And people forget now that's what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you could get picked up in London, arriving at an airport, and they could lock you away for 6, 7 days with no communication, not even tell your family you're alive or dead. And that was completely legal as anti-terrorism. And when you've got a young family, I had Johnny was, I think, about 12 or 13 at the time, and a 9-year-old. There's no way you could take a risk to your family to
Absolutely.
come walking back as a volunteer.
Yeah.
Plus the fact I was living on a tropical island with a boat. I bought a restaurant there to keep some income coming in. I had a house there. We had 2 lovely housemaids, one for the morning, one for the afternoon, that cooked local food. Life was a dream.
Yeah, you weren't rushing back for
I
your
certainly wasn't rushing back.
your McDonald's in the UK.
Absolutely not. And I had many journalists came out to see me there and talk to me. Paxman, the BBC newsman,
Very good,
he
yes.
conducted a telephone interview with me and challenged me as to why I wouldn't go back. And I explained to him the same as I have to you.
Yeah.
You know, if they give a guarantee that, they won't lock me up under prevention of terrorism, and they didn't need to.
Yeah.
It was one option.
Yeah.
But if it could be dealt with by appointment, why wouldn't it be in the most sensible way? If they have evidence to arrest me, that's fine. But there was no evidence.
It's bonkers. So you are officially retired?
I am, as I always say, semi-retired.
So what does life look like for you now? What does business look like for you now? Tell me about that.
Well, I'm an advisor to a certain agency here. When they need advice, which is not very often, to be frank about it. I have a few of my old private clients that keep in touch with me for social events and a little bit of advice here and there. And I spend most of my time researching my next book, which hopefully will be within a month or 2.
Brilliant.
And maybe a reprint of the existing one,
Yeah.
a few modifications,
Yeah.
and cruising.
Of course.
Yes.
So this book here, Private Eye's Secret Spy, My Life as Britain's Most Controversial PI. There's so much rhythm and rhyme to that I love it. Why do you feel like it was important for you to tell this story? Or it's really a collection of stories?
Yes. Well, fundamentally, it explains to those that read it the events as I see them from my side. Because you can pick up newspapers and you can misinterpret what you read, and you could turn me into some figure of hatred. And this, I think, balances it out. It kind of gives the reasoning for things, why things were done,
Yep.
how they were dealt with. My never-ending battle with the London Metropolitan Police, which started way back in the late 60s. For reasons which, it's hard to understand it. It's just one of those things. No other police force, just the Met. Yes. And they've gone after me and my agency continuous. We made a lot of newspaper coverage, a lot of material on different cases, high-profile cases that embarrass them, like catching senior police officers taking bribes and corruption, and seeing those senior police officers being found guilty at the Old Bailey and going to prison for 8 years. And I was, and my colleagues were prosecution witnesses, although we weren't called, but we were witnesses for the prosecution.
Yeah.
Another case that's in there, we were witnesses for Nottingham Police against a major betting organisation. And again, this kind of upset the police because some of those that were ultimately prosecuted were serving police officers. So there's some issues like that.
Yeah.
We've lived in an area where we're in the grey area between black and white in legal sense.
Of course.
And not everybody likes it.
Yeah. Well, no one likes to be caught with their pants down.
Indeed.
Ian, I've really, really enjoyed listening and chatting with you today. There's so much. I mean, there's literally dozens and dozens of stories in here. We only covered really one or two of them today.
Yes.
And I'm really, really grateful for everything that you shared. Would highly recommend for anyone listening or watching, if you'd like to find out more about Ian, if you'd like to dig into some of these incredible stories, highly recommend picking up the book. Again, Private Eye, Secret Spy. It'll be in the description of the episode. You can click it. It'll take you straight there. And other than that, Ian, just want to thank you for your time today.
My pleasure.
Real pleasure. I learned a lot. I'm always like to become less ignorant about things that I'm very ignorant about. And certainly this whole world of PI and the business component to it, I find really interesting. You know, listening to you today, like it's a business story as well as anything else.
Absolutely.
You know, and what an interesting business to be a part of. So yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
And thank you very much for listening and watching. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. That's it.